NHL expansion has always been imperfect. In some cases, the entire process has been entirely too rushed. Other times, no one's bothered to sit down and think about the unintended consequences of what was happening. But by and large, the league has made some attempts to make sure these new teams weren't utterly abject. The 16 expansion in 1967 saw all the new teams placed in their own conference and kind of allowed just to do their own thing. It was not pretty, but it was kind of fun overall, especially considering the riff-raff that was made available to these teams in the 1967 expansion draft. In the various 1970s NHL expansion drafts, the new franchises received the top selections in that year's entry draft, in addition to picking various castoffs. And then you have WHA teams coming into the NHL, which is just its own thing entirely. Then 1991 came along, and it was finally time for the National Hockey League to have an even number of teams. For more than a decade, it had just been rolling with 21. However, to get to 22 teams, it involved the single wildest, the single weirdest NHL expansion of all time.
For their very first introduction ever, your San Jose Sharks.
The story of the San Jose Sharks and the single weirdest NHL expansion of all time, well, it actually begins all the way back in 1975. That is when California Golden Seals minority owners George and Gordon Gunn convinced then majority owner Melvin Swig to move the franchise to Cleveland. It was a disastrous decision, mostly due to the fact that everything happened at the absolute very last minute. Most folks in Cleveland didn't even realize they had an NHL team in town till well after the fact. That's how slapdash this relocation was, as well as how poor the outreach of the Barons was to the Cleveland market. After nearly going bankrupt, Swig received a bailout from the NHL to keep the team afloat before being bought out by the Gunn brothers entirely. The following season in Cleveland was not much better, and the NHL decided to merge the struggling Barons with another franchise that was barely keeping the lights on, that being the Minnesota North Stars. Things didn't really go much better despite moving further north again, although the North Stars did manage two wildly unlikely Stanley Cup runs under the Gunn stewardship. Anyway, the brothers were struck with another bout of wanderlust after being unable to turn a profit in Minnesota with their hockey franchise. But get this, where did the Gunns want to move their hockey franchise to? The Bay Area. That's right, the same place they had abandoned 15 years prior. The NHL was not all that keen on removing a hockey team from the state of hockey, while owners really loathed the idea of losing a potential expansion market and the fees which came with it. After quite a bit of behind closed door haggling, much of the details which have never been made public, it was announced that the Gunns would be selling the Minnesota North Stars to a local ownership group for $31.5 million, and in turn they would receive an expansion franchise in San Jose, California for $50 million. It was an arrangement that was all types of laughable. For starters, the ownership group that purchased the North Stars said they were committed to keeping the team in Minnesota, LOL. And then you have the Gunns, who in order to do this, in order to get the league to sign off on this entire convoluted deal, had to make a large number of concessions to the other NHL owners. Perhaps none more larger than forfeiting the right to the number one overall pick in the 1991 NHL entry draft. The top selections of the draft had typically gone to expansion franchises before their first season in the league. However, hockey owners had zero desire to not only let the Gunns have their way in getting from Minnesota to San Jose, but also receiving the gift of the next one, Eric Lindros, as part of the arrangement. Having little room to negotiate here, the Sharks owners gladly accepted the number 2 pick in the 1991 draft and went along their way building a new franchise. It turns out, though, the Gunns were not all of that interested in an expansion franchise per se. What they were actually looking for was to take a bunch of random parts from Minnesota out west with them. To that extent, San Jose took North Stars general manager Jack Fiera, assistant general manager Dean Lombardi, and chief scouts Chuck Grillo and Les Jackson with them to the West Coast. This is where things really start going sideways here. Not only did the Gunns want those front office staff, they were also insistent upon being able to take Minnesota North Stars players with them to San Jose. So much so that they were willing to forego a traditional expansion draft. Interestingly, little is known about the deal reached between San Jose and Minnesota and the NHL. What we do know is that an agreement was reached between all of these parties when the deal was first announced for the Guns to land that San Jose expansion franchise. Then the awful, the terrible, the no good Norm Green came into the North Stars ownership picture, hated the terms of the deal that he found, which included the Sharks taking 30 players from Minnesota with very light restrictions in place. Green managed to get more protections put in place as far as who the Sharks could not take from the North Stars player pool. This also included the reduction on the number of skaters the new team could select. Ultimately, Minnesota was allowed to protect 14 skaters and 2 goaltenders, along with 1990 draft picks and limits on the number of unsigned prospects and players signed during the 1990 offseason. The renegotiated agreement between Minnesota and San Jose really made little sense for the Guns to proceed. Yet proceed they did. Fiera, Lombardi, and the Guns plowed full steam ahead, mostly because they didn't want to lose out on all the players they had connections to, that they had time invested in with Minnesota. That brings us to the 1991 NHL dispersal draft. For starters, this took place 5 days after the Minnesota North Stars season had ended. Now, it had ended so late because they made a miracle run to the Stanley Cup Finals that year. But the appearance of Minnesota in the championship round, well, it just added an extra level of awkwardness to proceedings. There was quite a bit of scuttlebutt around the league revolving around the dispersal draft. Originally, a lot of general managers complained that it was too favorable to San Jose. But by the time the new restrictions were put into place, it really became a burden on them. They were really the losers here. Basically, any player with any sort of value to Minnesota was off limits. When the 1991 dispersal draft was done and dusted, the Sharks left with a bunch of players Minnesota probably didn't mind losing. The Sharks landed 3 NHL players, goalie Brian Hayward, and blue liners Neil Wilkinson and Rob Zettler, none of whom lasted more than 3 seasons with the team. The Sharks front office took a 4th NHL player from Minnesota's roster, Shane Sherla, but then traded him back after the expansion draft anyway. The only players from the dispersal draft who had any sort of impact in the NHL were Arturs Irbe, Tom Peterson, and Doug Zamolik, a trio of lottery ticket picks who had solid, but if we're being honest, unspectacular NHL careers. I know some out there will criticize me for saying that about Irbe, but let's be honest here. He had a miracle run with the Sharks that we will get to, but was by and large not a remarkably effective NHL goaltender. The most significant move made by the Sharks front office during the dispersal draft was not taking a North Stars player, that player in question being Mike Craig. For unknown reasons, Minnesota opted not to protect the forward who was their 2nd round pick in 1989. In exchange for not taking Craig, San Jose would receive a 1991 2nd round pick and a 1992 1st rounder from the North Stars. This would be by far and away the best move of the dispersal draft. San Jose nabbed Sandis Ojulins with the 1991 2nd rounder while drafting Andrei Nazarov with the 1st round selection a year later. Both would make contributions in San Jose, but more importantly, they were flipped for better players down the track in trades. Craig hung around the NHL during the 1990s, even having a cup of coffee with San Jose toward the end of the decade, but in no way, shape, or form was he worth the draft pick capital given up by the North Stars. More importantly, given the protections that Minnesota had, you would have thought they would have found a way to keep them, especially because it seems like they were sort of working with San Jose here, but I digress. With the dispersal draft out of the way, we now turn our attention to the 1991 expansion draft, which was held the same day immediately after the dispersal draft had been completed. In addition to making sure the Guns couldn't have Eric Lindros, NHL owners really nerfed the expansion draft player pool to limit their losses. Instead of giving the Sharks and North Stars a list of players who were protected and then allowing them to select whoever they wanted that wasn't on those protected player lists, the teams were provided with the names of skaters who were eligible to be drafted. Even by NHL expansion draft standards, these lists were dire. They also contained a farcical number of retired players or inactive players. Seriously, Ken Dryden was left unprotected by the Montreal Canadiens and was put on a list of eligible players to be drafted. This is 1991, by the way. Dryden had retired in 1979, and he'd been in the Hockey Hall of Fame for almost a decade by this point. So how the hell does this happen? How do the expansion teams get submitted lists with a bunch of retired players, many of whom had been retired for several years? According to an article on NathanGabby.com, the NHL offices blamed the teams, some of which submitted lists including players who had retired but they still held the rights to. Teams blamed the NHL offices because they were simply fulfilling their duty to submit lists that had all of the players that they held rights to. In their mind, it was on the NHL to create the eligible draft lists for the teams. Additionally, there were also 31 soon-to-be free agents included in the expansion draft player pool. But as the expansion draft rule stated, only one of these could be selected. Not one by each team, by the way, but just one in total. So if one team did it first, the other one couldn't. Similarly, only one player from each of the 20 NHL teams could be selected, with Minnesota getting 10 players and San Jose getting 10 players. With all of that out of the way, let's get to the expansion draft. The Sharks pick first, and who did they take? Another goaltender, this one being Jeff Hackett from the New York Islanders. This pick, by the way, highlights just how absolutely flawed the 1991 NHL expansion draft was. Everyone knew Minnesota was not in the market for netminders, and San Jose had already grabbed 5 goalies from the Minnesota North Stars in the dispersal draft. But because they couldn't risk Minnesota taking another Islanders player and making that roster ineligible to have another player taken, they were forced to grab Hackett. If I'm being completely honest here, there is absolutely nothing else worthwhile to mention from the 1991 NHL expansion draft apart from the final pick made by the North Stars. They scooped up Guy Lafleur from the Quebec Nordiques despite the fact he had already announced his retirement earlier in the year. According to Historical Hockey, Minnesota actually did not want to make this pick at all, but were forced to because of the rules. And not only that, but they were forced to take someone from the Quebec Nordiques. With the Sharks having taken the sole free agent allowed to be selected during the expansion draft, Minnesota GM Bobby Clarke had to do something clever, as he did not want to take on salary for a player he had no use for. That meant he would take Lafleur in the expansion draft. This would lead to one of the most unnecessary trades in hockey history. Minnesota would trade the retired Lafleur to Quebec because he needed to actually be on the Nordiques, as they wanted to give him a job with the team. But that could not happen if his rights were held by the North Stars. In exchange for their efforts, Minnesota received some guy who hadn't played in the NHL for years. Bureaucracy, folks, you gotta love it. As the expansion draft was happening, both teams made several trades involving players they had taken. For example, San Jose had selected Tim Kerr from the Philadelphia Flyers and turned around and shipped him off to the New York Rangers for Brian Mullen. All of those trades, by the way, were announced on expansion dispersal draft day. What was not announced on that day, though, were a few transactions made between the North Stars and the Sharks. A day later, the teams announced the not taking Craig and future considerations for the 2 draft picks deal. Then 4 days later, another deal appeared on the transaction wire involving the 2 teams. San Jose had swapped Shane Sherla, who they had selected in a dispersal draft, for Kelly Kissio. In other words, the Sharks swapped the player they took in the dispersal draft for a player they could have taken in the expansion draft, if not for a bunch of convoluted rules. Seriously, why were they even bothering? With the expansion and dispersal drafts in the books, the San Jose Sharks walked away with a really bad, totally unready for NHL roster. What they did have on their hands was a championship caliber minor league hockey team. In fact, the Kansas City Blades, the Sharks' IHL affiliate, would go on to win the title in 91-92. That first season for the big league club, though, it was extremely rough. That's probably putting it lightly. The first 2 seasons for the Sharks in San Jose, well, technically San Francisco, they were playing at the Cow Palace, by the way, a facility that the NHL had barred the Golden Seals from playing in, but we won't get into that, were diabolic. 17 wins and 39 points in year 1, 11 wins and 24 points in 92-93. Turns out no one at the Cow Palace really minded the bad hockey on display. In fact, everyone I've ever talked to who attended Sharks games at the Cow Palace have nothing but positive things to say about the experience. Maybe positive's not the right word here, but they don't speak down on it because of what was happening on the ice. This brings us to the team's third season and their first official campaign in San Jose. By this time, only 2 of the players the Sharks took in the expansion draft were still on the roster. Well, it's technically, you can say it's 3 if you wanted to include Kissio, although again, he wasn't taken by the Sharks in the expansion draft. The dispersal draft results were slightly better, with 5 of those players making it past the second season, although only 3 would remain by the time the trade deadline passes. Something magical happened in that third season, though, something that really kind of defies all basic hockey logic. After hiring Kevin Constantine to replace George Kingston, the team entered 1993-94 with 0 expectations, but a pretty nice and new place to play. Although, for some reason during this year, they also played a handful of games at Arco Arena in Sacramento, which feels weird considering they were playing in a new barn, but whatever. After starting the season 0-8-1, the team managed to turn things around and would eventually clinch the 8th seed in the Western Conference playoffs. There is a caveat I do feel like I need to mention here. The San Jose Sharks actually finished with the same number of wins, 33, as the 9th placed Anaheim Mighty Ducks, the Mighty Ducks of Anaheim, as they were known then. Anyway, San Jose finished this season with an oddly impressive 16 ties, which was 11 more than Anaheim, and a number that would propel them to the postseason. Honestly, I would argue that system is more respectable than what we have in today's NHL, where simply showing up to the rink with a pulse basically gets you a point these days, but you know what? Let's not get hung up on that. The Sharks' first foray into the playoffs would see them match up against an original 6 side, the Detroit Red Wings. Here they pulled off one of the most ludicrous upsets in hockey history, an upset that Red Wings fans don't understand, that Sharks fans don't understand. It really is something that now, even 30 years later, is still pretty difficult to process. Somehow, some way, despite being outshot, despite being outscored by Detroit, the Sharks would emerge victorious in 7 games, much to the chagrin of those Red Wings fans. San Jose did almost go one better in the Western Conference semifinals. They took the Toronto Maple Leafs to 7 games, but would ultimately come up short in that elimination contest. As for Minnesota, the other participant in these shenanigans, well, their story has an unfortunate ending. They did make the playoffs in 1991-92, but their ownership group was terrible, awful. Eventually, Norm Green would get majority control of the franchise, which was just an abomination. He, of course, then moves the Minnesota North Stars to Dallas before the 1993-94 season. That, though, can be a story for another time. When we look back at the San Jose Sharks and their first 2 seasons in the NHL, well, they weren't the out-and-out worst. As far as on-ice performance, you could argue the Washington Capitals and Ottawa Senators were even more lousy, if that's even possible, than San Jose. But as far as the expansion draft and everything about a new franchise coming into the NHL, 1991 was the weirdest, and it was unquestionably the worst. The thing is, though, San Jose gave themselves the short end of the stick here. The Guns' willingness to accept whatever unfavorable terms imposed on them, either by the NHL in terms of the entry draft or Minnesota in terms of the dispersal draft player selections, it kind of just, I don't get it. I don't understand why they felt compelled to do this. Giving up the right to draft Eric Lindros in 1991 is just flat out dumb, especially considering that given the expansions of the NHL during the early 90s, San Jose was also boxed out of the first overall pick the following season despite finishing with the worst record in the league. That was bad, but maybe it was unavoidable. If the Guns wanted to go to San Jose, they were going to have to accept that. What was downright foolish, though, and completely avoidable, was the Guns' desire to take a bunch of random parts from the Minnesota North Stars. Perhaps the original agreement between San Jose and Minnesota would have seen them landed a few more quality contributors. We don't know. We don't know the original terms of that agreement and what they were supposed to get. But what did happen was good for nobody. Had the leadership of San Jose decided to bail on the dispersal draft part of this and said, you know what, we don't like the terms Norm Green wants, we're going to just do an expansion draft, at least maybe the NHL takes time to appropriately composing a list of available players instead of just throwing on any dude who had retired in the past decade. It was not all negative. There are a pair of silver linings we can highlight here. The first being that the Kansas City Blades would go on to win a championship in the IHL in 1991-92, although basically no one from that team, apart from some of the Sharks draft picks, would make it to the big league club. The second was that this expansion made San Jose so terrible, so god-awful, that they just were able to sift through the players and get rid of the rubbish far quicker than I guess other teams had been allowed to do, other expansion sides had in the past. Proof of that can be seen in 1994 in that first playoff game. Only 4 of the 34 players taken by San Jose in the dispersal draft and the expansion draft were on the ice that night for the franchise's first postseason fixture. Now, it helped that 8 of 12 Western Conference teams made the playoffs, and the Pacific Division was the absolute worst division in hockey during that first playoff season. But beggars cannot be choosers, and if you're in, you're in. There has never been an expansion quite like what the NHL did in 1991, before or since then, and really across all of sports. It was terrible, the weirdest, the worst. This moment though, it made everyone forget just how bad the 1991 NHL expansion was.
They never once couldn't believe that they could win this.
San Jose will advance. Detroit will go home.
Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to learn more about how Uwe Krupp was the most unlikely hero in hockey history, well, the video in the lower right-hand corner of your screen is the place to go. And for more on the absolutely ridiculous nature of NHL team relocations, video upper right-hand corner of your screen. Until next time, I am Cheyenne Hollis. This is The Touchback, and as always, hashtag take it out to the 25.